This video is part of a multi-channel collaboration called Dragon Week. For the Dragon Week playlist, please check out the description. When the skies above were not yet named, nor the earth below pronounced by name, Apsu, the first one, their begetter, and maker Tiamat, who bore them all, had mixed their waters together. This is the beginning of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation, originally composed sometime in the late 2nd millennium BC. But this is supposed to be a D&D video. Why am I telling you about ancient cuneiform tablet texts? How is this going to relate to everyone's favorite five-headed dragon goddess? And who am I? Hey everyone, my name is Apollo, and in this video we're going to be exploring the goddess Tiamat, her role in the epic of creation. We're going to have a brief look at her interpretation as a Chaos Kampf, and how she was then transformed into a monster. With all that background info in mind, we will then have a look at how Tiamat has been adapted for Dungeons & Dragons over the many editions of the game, and how we can add in some extra flavor from the original mythological Tiamat to bring some more nuance to your gaming table, should your party ever come across the Dragon Queen herself. Let's go. Though the earliest mention of Tiamat is an old Akkadian incantation, she mainly becomes the subject of theological works after the composition of the Enuma Elish, where we get her origin story in the first tablet of the epic. She is the personification of the waters of creation. She is the primordial salt sea, and her partner Apsu is the primordial sweet sea, and in the mingling of their waters they create the gods. Because we're talking about gods and primordials, the framing of the story that follows happens before the creation of the physical world, but exists in a space that is the primordial sea itself, but also maybe inside Tiamat's womb. I choose to not think about it too much, but anyway. Apsu and Tiamat beget the gods Lahmu and Lahamu, who join together and produce the gods Anshar and Kishar, and then they in turn have their firstborn god, Anu. That was a lot of names in quick succession, but hey, if I was stuck in the primordial womb of creation and was a god with nothing else to do, I'm just saying maybe they didn't have that many activities on the table, okay? As the new gods are being born, they gather and they cause a ruckus, upsetting Tiamat. Apsu gets quite fed up with this eventually, and though Tiamat indulges the gods in their revelry, Apsu decides that he's going to try put a stop to them to restore some order, and in trying to do this, the god Anu kills Apsu, buries him within Tiamat, and builds a temple over Apsu's grave, within which he will later have his son be born, the god Marduk. Now that's just straight up disrespectful. But as time passes, more gods are born, and eventually the elder gods become annoyed by their restlessness and the stirring up of the primordial waters. So they, wanting to put the younger gods in their place, go to Tiamat and say to her, "Because they slew Apsu your lover, and you did not go to his side but sat mute. He has created the 4 fearsome winds to stir up your belly on purpose, and we simply cannot sleep. Was your lover Apsu not in your heart? No wonder you sit alone. Are you not a mother? You heave restlessly, but what about us, who cannot rest? Don't you love us? Our grip is slack and our eyes are sunken. Remove the yoke of us restless ones and let us sleep. Set up a battle cry and avenge them. Conquer the enemy and reduce them to naught." The gods plead, and they appeal to her sense of guilt over not striking down the gods after the murder of Apsu, where she refused to destroy what she herself had helped create. They use her guilt and appeal to her motherhood to get her to take arms against the young gods, and this time it works. Even without her partner, Tiamat is still a creator goddess, and she makes herself an army of monsters. Most lists that exist will give the number as 11, as the number of children that she creates to fight the gods, among which are giant snakes, dragons, scorpion men, bullmen, hounds, and many others. Tiamat marches with her monstrous progeny to confront Marduk, who by this point has rallied the support of all the other gods under him to make him their champion and their future ruler. In their confrontation, Marduk uses his control over the winds to cause even more turmoil within Tiamat and challenges her to single combat. Tiamat's magic proves not to be enough against the weapons of the gods, and she is pinned down by the winds and slain by Marduk. He then uses her body to shape the world, splitting her in half to create the heavens and earth. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers spring from her eyes, the mountains from her breasts, and her limbs into the many other geological features of the world. And finally, her tail becomes the Milky Way. Now, I don't know about you, but if my downstairs neighbors, who were also my great-great-great-grandchildren, killed me for telling them to stop having parties and then build a new house out of my body, which doesn't really work on a human scale, but you get what I mean, I'd be pissed. But more on Tiamat's divine rage later. Tiamat's role in the Epic of Creation lines up pretty well with a mythological motif called the Chaos Kampf, where a god that represents order defeats a serpent, which is often female or in some way the god's ancestor, that represents chaos in order to create a new structure for the cosmos. The motif tends to pop up a lot around ancient Near Eastern and to a wider extent in worldwide mythologies and religions. Like for example, you have Indra versus Vritra in India, Zeus versus Typhon in Greece, Ra versus Apophis in Egypt, and noticeably, for us for reasons that we will talk about a little bit more later, Yahweh versus the monstrous Leviathan. Many interpretations exist for what the Chaos Kampf represents, and this video isn't going to be a deep dive into that, but often themes include echoes of victory over chaos, a new generation triumphing over the old, and maybe even a callback to patriarchal societies overthrowing older matriarchal ones, and then turning those older mother goddesses into monsters. And speaking of turning into a monster, it's worth looking at how Tiamat began being depicted as a dragon, because her representation in art is a little bit all over the place. In the text itself, she is represented as both a body of water, but also a woman and having a tail. There aren't any Mesopotamian images that have properly been identified as an image of Tiamat, with older identifications in art having been rejected, like this one, that used to be identified as Marduk battling Tiamat, but more modern interpretations see as it possibly being Anzu and Ninurta. Though by the late Hellenistic period, there is a depiction of her in art where she is represented as having serpent tails as legs, as shown in the relief of the Temple of Bel in Palmyra, in modern-day central Syria. So how do we get from here to full dragon? Let me introduce you to George A. Barton. He was a Canadian clergyman and author, as well as a professor of history of religion and Semitic languages, and he wrote an article in 1890 titled Tiamat, where he compares her to Leviathan, as we mentioned before, and also with the dragon from the Book of Revelations, who is described as an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. A description that should start to sound familiar for Dungeons & Dragons fans. Barton described Tiamat as a female dragon, queen of a hideous host who are hostile to the gods. Also make note of that. Right, so we have a primordial creator goddess who gets killed by a newer generation of gods, interpreted as representative of evil giving way to order, and whose depiction becomes more and more monstrous and noticeably draconic across millennia. I think it's time we talk D&D. So, Tiamat has been a part of the game since 1st edition. Back then, she was classified as an archdevil, not a goddess though. She serves under Asgarath, who is a draconic god that some myths claim created the D&D multiverse itself, but she also serves as Modius, the Lord of the Nine Hells, as she resides in the topmost lair of Avernus. She rules the infernal plains of Avernus, where she has her own personal lair, and all evil dragonkind are considered to be her offspring. She also gets her iconic look solidified in 1st edition of being a 5-headed dragon. In 2nd edition, she's given an upgrade to being a lesser deity. No longer an archdevil, the dominion of Avernus is passed down into the hands of characters like Baal and Zariel, whose squabbling she just doesn't really care for. Though her personal castle lair does still remain in Avernus, and she will every now and then do Asmodeus a solid of keeping track of who's trying to move in and out of the first layer of the Nine Hells. The important thing is that she has maintained her deific status ever since. In 4th editions, her origins get a little bit of new lore, as she's said to be the offspring of Asgarath himself, the original draconic god who was cut in half by a primordial, creating both her and the platinum dragon god Bahamut. But there are many, many origin stories and myths about Tiamat in D&D, including one where she is the sole mother of dragonkind, with even Bahamut being a child of hers. Well, personally, by far my most favorite origin for Tiamat is the one expressed in the Elegy of the First World, a poem from the 5th edition book Fizban's Treasury of Dragons that proposes a cosmology of the D&D multiverse where Bahamut and Tiamat are the creators, with this story supposedly being passed down by dragons for generations. Breathe, dragons. Sing of the first world, forged out of chaos and painted with beauty. Sing of Bahamut, the platinum, molding the shape of the mountains and rivers. Sing too of chromatic Tiamat, painting all over the infinite canvas. Partnered, they woke in the darkness. Partnered, they labored in acts of creation. That's how the poem opens, describing them coming to consciousness in the cosmos. They then create Sardior, the deity of gem dragons, together, and populate the first world with dragons. And then, breathe, dragons. Sing of the old ones. War-bringer gods with their mortal adherents. Teeming they came to the first world, seeking a home for their legions of followers, mighty in magic and numbers, conquering deities seized their victory. Fallen was noble Bahamut, Sardior hid in the heart of creation. Breathe, dragons. Sing now of Tiamat, raging in battle with no hope of victory. She would not flee or surrender, fighting as death reached its cold claws towards her. Warbringers seized her and bound her, snatched her from death, entombed her in torment, sealed in the darkness forever, captive to gods laying claim to creation. A pretty condemning image. The second last verse of the poem calls back to Tiamat's rage. Breathe, dragons. Sing of her freedom, Tiamat loosed from her prison of torment. Tell how she, too, rallied her children, dragons chromatic, a spectrum of mayhem. Sing of her fury, her vengeance, lightning and venom, ice, fire, and corrosion, five-headed, monstrous, and mighty, rampaging on a campaign of destruction. Now, does this narrative sound familiar to anyone? A primordial goddess who shapes the world, whose home is overrun by new gods, and when she fights them, she's defeated. The Elegy of the First World reads like someone had a copy of the Enuma Elish in their hand while they were composing it, and also probably some Homeric poetry, but that is beside the point. For sure, the Tiamat of the Elegy has been influenced by the pop culture perception of mythological Tiamat, as well as her established lore within Dungeons & Dragons. Noticeably, her outward rage, her explicit draconic appearance, and her association with the Hells. But in the early verses of the Elegy, we see what could have been a life-giving mother of dragons and creator of the world. Personally, I don't think that Tiamat has done anything wrong. Yeah, okay, look, anytime she's released from Avernus, she immediately goes on a rampage and destroys a city. But look, if you built a home and then a group of people and their followers invaded, locked you in the basement, and then for millennia, they created propaganda about how you're evil and a creator of monsters, I think I'd have a crash out as well. I think she's justified. God forbid a woman have hobbies. In this version of the narrative, the gods are conquerors, and Tiamat's rage is one of liberation and rebellion. Which leads me to what I think is an unexplored take on Tiamat and what she could be. The patron goddess of revolutionaries. Yeah, look, I'll admit it is incredibly fun to have an uncomplicated big evil dragon villain, but picture this. You're living in a city that for decades has been bled dry and exploited by the ruling nobility. Every night, they host parties of extravagance so ostentatious you couldn't imagine it in your wildest dreams. All the while, the people of the city starve after giving away all the food they've worked to cultivate. Plague spreads from the bodies piling in the streets, and any attempt to raise your voice to injustice earns you a beating from the city guard. You walk the streets all night looking for some scraps to bring home to feed your loved ones, listening to that damned music echoing from the royal palace. It's not fair that they should reap all the benefits of the work of ordinary people and then discard them. You deserve more than the crumbs of your own labor. Rain beating down on you, you fall on your knees and call out to any god that may be listening. Your call is answered by 5 voices, speaking in unison. I hear your cry, fledgling. What is yours should not have been stolen, and if you want the power to stand up to your oppressors, I will grant it. But know this, if you pledge yourself to me, there will be a day where I march my chosen against the celestial heights and reclaim what the gods stole from me, and you will march in my army. This version of Tiamat would seek out individuals and groups that align with her ideals of anger and the struggle to achieve freedom. Rebellions, freedom fighters, any sort of anti-colonialist movement would be ripe for the patronage and worship of Tiamat. But her power, whether granted to a cleric, warlock, or in any other way, would come with the condition of renouncing any other gods that the person may have worshipped before. Not because Tiamat is concerned with growing her following, but because if she's going to take back her home from the grasp of the gods, she's going to need your help to do it. And there we have it. A look at Tiamat in mythology from her ancient origins to some of her lore in the 50-year history of Dungeons & Dragons, and a possibly new way to view her story and bring it to your gaming table. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you to Pointy Hat and Ginny D for putting together Dragon Week. It's been a pleasure yapping to y'all about dragons for however long this video ends up being, and I hope to see you next time.